Hello, and I'm Jan Scoyles from the Real Asset Company. Today we're interviewing Detlev Schlichter, author of Paper Money Collapse. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jan.
You are an Austrian economist, primarily, and you just finished writing Paper Money Collapse about a year ago. I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was great, and I particularly appreciate how it gets to the basics, but it's also particularly in-depth as well. Not to ruin the ending for anybody, it's not a happy ending. But what I'm curious about is your background is in finance for about 20 years.
About 20 years.
So what happened during that time that made you sort of suddenly look at the complete opposite kind of economic theory that pushes those financial markets?
As you said, I worked in finance for 20 years. I had an education before that in economics. I studied economics, and like most people, I studied the mainstream variety of economics. I did not study Austrian school economics at university. But I discovered the Austrians at the end of my university studies, and throughout my 20 years in finance, or almost 20 years in finance, I continued to read Austrian school texts, in particular the work by Ludwig von Mises, but really by all the other Austrian scholars as well. So I think when you read that kind of body of Austrian theory, you come to ask certain questions, fundamental questions about our monetary system. And then what happened to me is at the same time in my work life, I experienced how our financial system was getting more and more unstable. I could see a lot of the phenomena in my work life that the Austrians had described very well. I could see how artificially low interest rates would encourage these credit cycles, but that they ultimately would peter out and turn into a credit bust. And now that we try to re-stimulate the economy by pumping more money into it, and thereby postponing ultimately the dissolution of these imbalances ever further. So I could see all this play out somehow, and I was somewhat amazed that the Austrian school had explained it so well, but in the environment I was working in, people didn't appreciate those insights. I think things for me came a little bit to a head in 2008 when I felt we had reached a point where these imbalances were now so big and the policy that was conducted to push the system out further was getting ever more extreme, that I felt like we reached some kind of endpoint. And that's when I decided to leave the industry, and you're right, I left the industry in 2009. The book came out last September, so it's taken me about sort of 2 years to get the book published. And I do think we're in some kind of end game scenario for our fiat money system right now.
And when you were working, did you find it frustrating that people didn't stop and look? I mean, all these crises were happening, and you're obviously working through the 90s when there was a series of events that were going on through the 90s, like the East Asian crash and what was happening in Russia. Were you frustrated that no one else in your workplace was sat there going, well, hang on, there's something up here?
Yeah, it was very frustrating, and I have to say I worked with many very smart people. It's not like these were highly intelligent people. It's very interesting now looking back. I do strongly feel that there's something like an intellectual bubble in the financial industry. So it's not that people are stupid, they're not. But certain ideas, certain paradigms of how to look at the world are just dominant. And I think that's probably the case in any kind of science or industry or anything that has a certain institutional setting. When people talk about phenomena, when people discuss economic problems, they always use the theories that they all share, that there's a basis for communication for them. And what happened over the last, I think, 40, 50, 60 years maybe, a certain subset of macroeconomic theories has begun to dominate our debate, and that's also the case in financial markets. It was frustrating, but it was also difficult for me for a long time to step out of it, because I remember very vividly, and if you look back in 2001, when after the Nasdaq bubble had burst, and then Alan Greenspan, the head of the US Federal Reserve at the time, kept interest rate at 1% to re-stimulate the economy. I felt at the time that was the wrong policy. But, and I think with hindsight, I think it's true, it was the wrong policy. It led to the mortgage bubble and to the big problems that then came to the surface in 2007. But, between, let's say, 2004 and 2007, there were again 3 years in which everybody felt that things were just going splendidly. And so it's very difficult to step outside of that environment and leave that industry and take a completely different view.
And how, since then, has your book been received by people that you worked with, or kind of just mainstream, you know, the mainstream media? And obviously, you know, you've obviously been on a lot of large news networks talking about it. How have they received it? You know, Radio 4 the other day.
Yeah, I think that's well. It's very different. I mean, overall, I'm very pleased with the reception because I think there's a lot of interest in the book, and I received a lot of very encouraging, positive feedback.
Had you been worried you weren't going to receive it?
I think when you write a book for the first time, I think the thing you're worried about most is that you're being ignored.
Yeah.
You know, I don't even mind people obviously criticizing it or, and really for me it was also a bit of a sort of an intellectual exercise in that I wanted to step out of the industry, think through these problems, and then put out the book and see if I made a mistake. I mean, who knows? Maybe people can tell me where I go wrong. And so I don't mind people trying to take the book apart or my arguments apart. And I gave my book before I published it a couple of friends, and some of them are certainly not Austrians, and some of them are much more closely linked to the present system and much more willing to defend it. And I think up to this day I've not come across anything. I mean, I'm sure there are mistakes in the book, and I'm sure I could write it better the second time, but I think the fundamental argument for me is still standing up. I think, so I'm very pleased with the reception. I still think that a lot of people, in particular in the finance industry, I think there is a tendency to not quite wanting to engage with it. I think most of them would. My perception is most of them give me credit for analyzing the problems correctly, and I think very few people have argued or tried to argue that the description of what the problems are with our monetary system are wrong. I think there's still that idea that, you know, it would not have to lead to some kind of collapse. There's somehow a way we can stabilize the system. There's somehow a way in which we can make it work. I think I've not come across anything that has convinced me that the system in its present form can be sustained. How it will end, you know, nobody can really say or when, but it's not going to last, and it will end badly.
Yeah, and I think, regardless of how your book's been received, which is great that it's been received well, I think it's actually the people that weren't in the mindset, the Austrian mindset beforehand, are certainly now led to ask more questions than they were before. Yeah, I think they're more aware of it.
I think that's definitely what I've tried to do. And in a way, it's interesting. As you can imagine, I think I got a lot of positive feedback from people who, in terms of methodology and ideology, are close to me, like, you know, Austrian school economists or libertarians, gold bugs. You know, obviously that's a ready audience. But having worked in finance for 20 years, I wanted to write a book for people that I work with. You know, in a way, I was trying to reach an audience that is not already, you know, versed in Mises and in Austrian school economics. And that's why I think what I try in the book, I go to quite a length to take all the arguments that I came across in my work life, in terms of the arguments that try to defend a fiat money system, arguments that defend why we need central banks that manipulate our interest rates and print money and stimulate the economy or stabilize the price level. You know, all the arguments that are being brought forward by mainstream economists in defense of our system and against the gold standard, I took them all very seriously and went through them. So in a way, it's more, I'm trying to convince more a larger audience. I don't try to preach to the choir.
No, I think, and I particularly appreciate that about the book. I mean, the very first chapter is what is money, because so many of us don't appreciate what money really is. You know, it's just this medium of exchange, but for so many people, money is what's produced by the government and what they tell you it is, and, you know, why there is enough gold in the world to have a gold standard. You know, all these kind of basic fundamental questions are answered. But one thing I am curious about is, I don't think once in your book, to my recollection, do you mention the word fiat money? And I wondered why you just referred to paper money as opposed to fiat money. Oh,
I think I'm fairly confident I used the word fiat money, but you're right, I didn't choose it for my title, and well, I think in a way the terms I use are paper money, elastic money,
yeah,
and then I think fiat money. I think I use them synonymously, they all mean the same for me. I think probably the best term for me is elastic money, and this is really what I'm talking about. So, because there's a lot of talk about, you know, we need to go back to gold because it's backed by something physical, and or even some people say intrinsic value, which I think is a very unfortunate term. I don't use it at all, and I think that's wrong. I think, and that's not the focus of my analysis. What I focus on is the elasticity of supply.
Yeah.
To have a medium of exchange that can constantly, at no cost, purely by the will of the central bank or the government, be expanded in its supply, is not good money. And it would have to lead to tremendous dislocations in the economy. That's the key argument. So the key point is the elasticity of supply. So elastic money is the term I like best. Paper money is the one we use traditionally. As to fiat money, I think I make it very clear in my book, every system of complete paper money, irredeemable paper money, has to be a fiat money system because it will be introduced by fiat, by state diktat. And this is a form of money that is under government control. It is politicized money. It is not possible to have a complete paper money system like we have it now and have it not under the control of politicians. It is always state money.
It was very interesting to hear about your book. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks much.